I'm happy to introduce Bernd Alles Tenhagen. He is nowadays working at the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment since 2007. He's a veterinarian. He has a training in animal health aspects and also in epidemiology, and is nowadays leading the group on antimicrobial resistance, zoonosis, and epidemiology at the Federal Health.
Together with her, she doesn't know where she's working.
Federal Institute for Risk Assessment. Yes, so. Well, I think it's very important to give him the floor for the next talk, the role of benchmarking in reducing antimicrobial consumption, because we heard already in the first presentation, there are a lot of selection pressures important, and one of these selection pressures is antimicrobial consumption. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for staying here with us. I'm the one that keeps you from the coffee break for the moment. We're slightly changing topic, so we're not talking so much about resistance, but on the other side of the medal, that is the use of antimicrobials. And what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is the German approach that we had in trying to reduce antimicrobial use in animals, which we identified as an important point. And what I'm going to lead you through is we start with defining the benchmarks. So how much antimicrobial is too much antimicrobial use? And the idea about our concept that we implemented in Germany. And then I'd like to tell you a bit about did it work or did it not work, or what were the limitations, come to some challenges, and finally give you some directions for the future. So this is actually the starting point of the debate in Germany. In 2011, we for the first time collected data on antimicrobial use in animals in a systematic way by asking the industry how much they sold to veterinarians. So veterinarians are the only source of antimicrobials for the farmers. So if you know how much is sold to them, you will know how much will end up in the farms, because the veterinarians mostly won't use it for themselves. And what we found at that time, we were number 4 in the European competition of using most antimicrobials. There were only 3 other countries that used more. I'm not going to address which countries that were, but definitely we were in a position that we felt we had to do something about it. And that raises, of course, a lot of questions. And the first question, of course, is if you see this previous slide, how much is too much? So you do have countries that actually have a use that's basically close to 0. That's, for example, Iceland here. And you do have other countries like Cyprus, or in that year it was Italy, for example, as well, that have a comparatively high use of antimicrobials. And probably the truth may be somewhere in between, but how much is too much? And there's several options that you have. You can, of course, say, and that is the one aspect that you see in the public debate sometimes, is saying, okay, any treatment is too much for animals, and we should reserve it to humans. That is, you can have the idea, but it's not a realistic approach. But then you run into animal protection troubles, because, of course, animals can get sick, and animals might need treatment, so you have to do something about it. So that is not realistic. Another approach that was taken by other countries is you form a working group. So if you don't know what to do, you form a working group, collect some people that are known and that are knowledgeable in the field, and they should agree on something. So they debate and debate and debate, and finally they come up with a solution, or at least a suggestion for a solution. The issue, and we had a lot of talks about communication in the morning, the issue is if you talk to the farmers, they would question the knowledgeability of these working groups that are usually made up of academics sitting in offices and not having to go in through the stables every day and do the dirty job about it. So the main question would be, what do they know? How can they tell us what we have to do? Could be my father, for example, asking such a question. And also my brother. It requires several working groups, because you have many different kinds of animals, kinds of husbandry systems, and all these husbandry systems may have different limits of reasonable use of antimicrobials. So quite a difficult approach. Some countries took it. We decided not to take it. Our approach was different. First of all, we focused on those branches of animal production where we knew that we have a high resistance issue, high level of resistance. And basically, if you want to sum it up, it is the fattening branch. The meat production branch is the branch that has the highest issue with resistance and most probably uses most of the antimicrobials. And then we let reality define the targets. So we don't sit at the green desk and decide on the targets, but we ask reality for the target. So the second point is, what is your unit? So how do you measure antimicrobial use? And there's plenty of there's a couple of reviews out there describing the different ways of measuring antimicrobial use in dairy farms or in any kind of animal farm. And if you look at them, they all have their pros and their cons, and so you have to decide on something. And for Germany, we decided on using a parameter that we call treatment frequency, and that's basically the number of animals, the days that animals are under treatment. Oops, sorry, go back. It's the wrong button. The number of days that animals are under treatment, the number of animals that are treated, and the number of antimicrobials that they get, and divided by the mean number of animals at risk in the period. So that was a fairly simple mathematical approach, so anyone from the sixth form could do it. And we calculate these data every 6 months. Of course, it's a lot of labor collecting these data, but we decided on doing the calculation every 6 months. And we did a separate calculation for each population. So we didn't compare apples and pears or broilers and calves, but we did a calculation for broilers, we did a calculation for turkeys, and for fattening pigs of different age groups. So younger pigs, because we knew they had received more, they would be in a different category than the older pigs. And we used these data to define a target. Now, how did we do that? Well, imagine this is actually fictional data, so it's no real data. But imagine you get a distribution of treatments per animal, per time period that looks similar to this one. So you have a number of treatment and you have a number of farms here. And you would end up usually with a distribution that looks somewhat like this. And the idea was that if we do it, if we derive the target from the true data, then the credibility of the targets would be good, or the acceptability of the target for the farmers would be good. And the other point is that we thought in the future we need flexible targets. So in the future targets, we may be able to reach targets that we now cannot think of. And if people had told me in 2011 that German farms would reduce antimicrobial use by 60%, I would have told them, yeah, well, that's what you want, but I don't think that's going to happen. But we'll see what happened. And then we just took typical measures, and that would be the median, somewhere around here, in yellow, and the third quartile. So 25% of the farms would be above this third quartile. These would be the top users. And 50% of the farms would be below the median, and then there's 25% here in between. And we would say, okay, those 25% should be able to do with less because all the other 75% can do. And which farmer was going to say, no, we can't do that because we're too stupid? So the idea was that the farmers would accept, if they know that most of the other farms doing the same kind of production that they do would be doing better, they would have the motivation to say, okay, let's try it. And then what we did was actually define these groups. So it was the group above the third quartile and the group in between the median and the third quartile, so between 50% and 75%. And the blue ones here, those are the ones that don't have to take action because they're on the lower side of the distribution. And then there would be consequences for the farmers, of course. So the consequence of for the yellow group is fairly simple. You're using more than half of your colleagues is using, so you might think about trying to reduce it, and you should discuss it with your vet. Typical explanation, if you have health issues with the animals, ask your vet. If you're in the red group, you need to do something about it, and something that farmers really don't like to do is you need to report to the local authority on how you want to reduce this use, because we said it is too high, 75% of the farms can do with less, so why can't you? And you have to explain that and have to design a plan on how you want to reduce it. And the good thing about it was that we did have a high credibility. There was not much debate about the level of the benchmarks that we defined in this way. Because while nobody can really argue against the benchmark that's derived from the real data, it would have been completely different if we had designed them on a desk. Even if we had given the same numbers, they would say, no, it's not realistic. Second point is, of course, high users can contribute a lot to reduction. If you're using only little antimicrobials, there's not a lot you can do about reducing it. So it's much more efficient if the high users reduce, because the progress then for the population would be much better. Then, in the long run, of course, if the high users reduce it, the median and third quartile will decline, because the high users are gone, ideally, and then the quartile will move downwards. So you have actually a mobile target that is leading to, ideally, that was the idea, having a permanent improvement of the situation. And you can set new targets based on the new situation, and targets that are unrealistic this year may be more realistic in 5 years, because if you want to change animal husbandry, that's not something that you can do like this, but it takes time. People have to invest in buildings, maybe, in structures, in management procedures, etc. So it will take time, and in the future, there may be new aims that can be reached easily. So basically, what we then did, implement the system, and then we hoped, okay, if we reduce now, you see that 6 treatments now is also above the third quartile. So the target is actually moving downwards. So the rules getting stricter for the farmers all the time. Of course, from a psychological point of view, it can be awful for some of the farmers, because they reduced their use and still they're in the red group. But that is something they have to live with. So they need to get better than their colleagues. That's the idea behind it. Interesting question about these management measures, of course, is, do they work? And we were really curious to see how it would work. And I think one of the graphs that in Germany, if you talk about this topic, is mostly shown is this one. And this is actually the antimicrobial sales data. So it's not the European comparison that you have seen in the beginning, but it's the sales data in Germany over the years. So the lowest bar is in 2011. We had this iconic 1,700 tons of antimicrobials being sold to veterinarians for use in animals. And what you can see in the first years, before we took action, actually, it was reducing. That was an issue of just being alert and being aware of an issue, and farmers starting to work on it, because they felt, well, they felt psychologically under pressure, of course, and also they felt they should do a good job, so they were starting to reduce it. And then we introduced this benchmarking system that I described in 2014, and then you see a massive drop between 2014 and 2015. It really went down, and in the first years it sort of went the way we would expect it, so it went down and down and down and down. Then we had 1 year where it didn't go down, but then it went up again. So that looks fairly good, looks like a big success. And then people claimed, they're only moving to those substances that are more efficient, and you don't need this amount, because it is a kilogram measure. So if you have a substance that is more concentrated in its power, they use less substance, but the antimicrobial effect may be even higher. So that was, of course, an idea. And for addressing this question, we looked at the substances, and they were already mentioned, the highest priority critically important antimicrobials by WHO, so those antimicrobials that are most important for human medicine, or considered most important for human medicine. And among them are, for example, if you see the long bars here, the green and the black bar, that is polymyxins, the colistin, basically colistin, and the macrolides. And what you can see is, with the macrolides, we just saw a parallel development to what we have seen in the other graphs. So it went down, and then it leveled at the lower, remained at the lower level. For the colistin, it kept constant for a while, and then it also went down dramatically. And then you see some little bars down here, and that is cephalosporins, third generation, and fluoroquinolones. And so to enable you to see them properly, I'll go to the next slide. And now I took out the colistin, and I took out the macrolides and changed the y-axis. And what you can see is that efficiently in for the fluoroquinolones in the beginning, so before the legislation and the benchmarking was implemented, we actually did see a rise in the use of fluoroquinolones. But then it dropped again afterwards. And for the cephalosporins, basically what you see is that nothing changed until 2018, when we had a legislation implemented. I think somebody else mentioned it today, legislation that cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones, they would require a resistance test before being used. So there was an additional hurdle, an obstacle for farmers and veterinarians to use these substances, and that led to a reduction of the use of these substances. Before, they would have claimed it's unavoidable, but suddenly, if there is an obstacle, it seems to be avoidable. So that's an issue of communication as well. In the European comparison, well, we actually dropped to rank number 11. And don't say it is a favorable or good position, but at least it's a better position than we used to have it in 2011. So there was some progress in this aspect. It's not the same progress for all substances, but there is, in general, it looks like progress. So did it work? Yes, but not fully. This is a different slide that you haven't seen before. It's also about the benchmarks. And you remember the red and the yellow group? And what you see here is actually the yellow bars show the median. So the top of the yellow bar is the median. And the top of the red bar is the third quartile of antimicrobial use. And so there's 25% of the farms above this use. And this is the different pig population, the different populations that we addressed in the system. There were 6 populations. It was basically pigs above and below 30 kilos, so weaned pigs below 30 kilos, fattening pigs above 30 kilos, and there were broilers for all their lifetime, which is short enough, and turkeys for all their lifetime, and there were calves below 8 months because we knew that those would be receiving more antimicrobials than the older ones, and beef animals above 8 months. And what you can see is that we couldn't actually evaluate the system with this only using the benchmarks because they were always below. The median was 0 in these recordings. But what you can see in the pigs here is what we did expect and what we wanted. And that is a drop from high numbers in the first year when we implemented this, and constantly, more or less constant decrease until the year 2022, which is the last bar that you can see here, the first half of this year. At a lower level, you see the same in the older pigs, also decreasing values, and values kept decreasing, albeit slowly, but they kept decreasing over the years. And then you have the broilers. 2 things. One thing, the level is much higher than it used to be in pigs, as you can see. And the other thing, it dropped rapidly. So they did a good job in the first years. And then it crept up again, which was not what we intended, and actually it was not what we expected. And well, we saw a similar thing in the turkeys and other poultry species, where we also see a substantial drop in the first year, but then a slight increase again, but now it drops again. And as I said, with the calves, where the level was so low that it was difficult really to evaluate these data finally. So what is this? Why is it? If we not only talk about antimicrobial use, but a resistance, in 2019 we were obliged to analyze the data that were gathered so far. There was a bit of an odd policy in Germany that they collected all these data, but then they would lock them in a cupboard. And then for this evaluation in 2019, they opened the cupboard and we were able to assess the data and look at the data and analyze the data. And what we could see is that compared to 2009, we did see all the green parts here mean an improvement. So we have the different animal species here that we've included: broilers, turkeys, pigs, and calves. And if it's green, it means that resistance has declined. And if it's gray, it means there is no change. And that mainly applies to those that have a low level of resistance anyway, like we have it, for example, in gentamicin. And if it is red, it means resistance has increased. And you remember that we saw this fluoroquinolone increase in the first couple of years. So this all looked like quite a bit of a success, at least compared to the early years before the system was implemented. If you look later on, you remember that the changes Where is it? Yeah. The changes were much smaller, so if you look at the later years, then you would expect less change in the resistance than you saw there. Interestingly, if you look at other bacteria, so we didn't only look at E. coli, which we typically look at. If we look, for example, at Campylobacter, we saw more red here, but this red also addresses ciprofloxacin and nalidixic acid, so the fluoroquinolones, where we actually over the years saw an increase. And we know that in Campylobacter, increase of resistance to fluoroquinolones is something that is not fully dependent on antimicrobial use. So there's another mechanism behind it. So it's not that easy that it's just use, but use helps. Reducing use helps a lot. So in summary, did it work? Yes. So overall, the benchmarking process was a success in helping to reduce antimicrobial use by actually, compared to 2011, it was a reduction by more than 60%. Compared to 2014, when the benchmarking was actually implemented, it was still a reduction of 50% from 1,230 tons to 600 tons every year. There was little debate with the farmers about feasibility of targets, at least in the general public there was little debate. I don't know about the local authorities, they may have had a lot of debate on it, but I can't tell actually. But what we saw, and that's why I said there's also a no, not all the addressed populations reacted as expected, which is something we have to consider for the future. So where we're going now? The legal framework that it's all based on is currently under revision. You know that the European drug law, veterinary drug law, has changed in 2019, and law has to be adapted to it. And we took this as an opportunity, based on the results of the evaluation of the old change in the drug law, to further develop the system. The general principle will be kept, so we will keep working with benchmarks that are derived from the data that we have. But there will be some changes. First of all, we will include further animal populations that haven't been included so far. So we didn't include, for example, dairy cows in the past. We didn't include the sows. We didn't include the laying hens, and they will be included in future. And then, of course, the consequences for high users will be adjusted to further improve the effect of assigning these people to the highest user group. There will be negative incentives for using the highest priority antimicrobials, so there will be additional factors that increase your value of treatment frequency. Targets will probably be valid for longer periods than in the past. So in the past, every 6 months there would be a new target, because it was always currently derived from the current data. And we will probably adjust that to longer target periods, so that we define a target and then we keep it for a couple of years and then redefine it, because progress will be slower in these populations. And another important point, I think more detailed progress reports will be published annually in the future, which I think is a very important aspect, that we always look and try to find the reasons why things work or don't work in the way that we expect them to work. And being rank number 11 in the European competition of the highest users, I think there's still room for improvement for Germany. I think we will have to continue doing a good job and a hard job, and especially farmers and veterinarians will have to continue doing a good and hard job for further improving the situation. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and thank all my colleagues at the Institute, and also the colleagues at BVL for the support in collecting these data, working with these data.